In this video, we'll be building startup logic for our mobile application and also setting up our unit testing. One of the most important things in a mobile application is the ability to navigate your user based on their previous session. This helps keep the engagement high and make sure that your user starts at the correct place. Today we'll be writing some code that obeys the following business rules. The first thing is, when a user doesn't have a session on disk, we go to the login view. This will allow the user to log in and then enter into our application. When a user does have a session on disk, the first thing we'll do is we'll try to sync that user information, and after that we'll check if the user has a default address. If they do, we'll take them to the home or main view, and if they don't, we will take them to the address selection view. That's all we're going to do today, but we are going to do it in a way that I find very beneficial in the long run. Not only for the code quality reasons, but also for productivity reasons. We'll be writing this in a TDD manner. I don't practice strict TDD, but it does help me to implement some of the more intimidating features that I have to tackle. It does this by providing me with immediate feedback, as well as providing me with a safety net during development so that I can refactor if I have a better idea in mind. With all that said, let's get started with the code. If you like these tutorials or any content on my channel, please consider subscribing or liking, because I would like to get this channel to 100,000 within this year. If you want to follow along and you haven't been following along, you can go to github.com/FilledStacks/boxed-out. You can download the code over there, and the code that we are currently using is in the source folder under the clients folder called customer. Once you have the code, the first thing that we'll do is we'll start by setting up our unit test. What we need that's most important for our unit testing is a mocking framework. And for that we'll use Mockito. You can open up the pubspec.yaml file, and then you can add in the Mockito package. Then we can start with setting up our test helpers for our unit testing. You can start by creating a new folder in the test folder called helpers, and inside that folder create a new file called test helpers. Given the code base, we know that we are writing tests for the startup view model, and the services that will be used in that view model will be based on the use cases above. We know that we are writing tests for the user service as well as our navigation service. If you want a full explanation of how to unit test and define your unit tests, there's a video in the top right of this video which will cover the unit testing. And if you want to know more about the mocking, you can check the second video that I'm also linking at the top called How to Mock on my channel. So in this test helpers file, what we will do is be setting up our mocking using the Mockito mocks generator. We'll start by creating the generate mocks annotation. Then we'll supply the mocks for the user service and the navigation service to be generated. We won't supply them as the initial list of mocks. Instead, we'll actually supply them to the custom mocks. And we'll do the same thing for the navigation service. The reason we are passing return null on missing true is because when you call a function that has not been stubbed, it will not throw an exception. If you supply this mock as a normal mock in the list above, and you call a function on that list, you will get an exception that says that there's no stub method for that matching call. Before we generate the code, we'll add one of the helper functions that we'll need to unregister our services that has already been registered. We'll create a new function called remove registration if exists that takes in a type T that extends object. And in this function, we will check if the type T is registered with the locator, and if it is registered, we will unregister that type. Just make sure that the property name is correct. I forgot to put stub at the end of return null on missing. Now that we have this basic setup, we can go ahead and run our build runner command. That will now generate a new class called testHelpers.mocks.dart, which will have the mocks generated based on what we passed to it. This means we are now ready to set up our service registration functions for mocking and verification on mock services. I've updated the stacked snippets, which I will link in the description below, but I have now added some additional snippets to help with the testing. To add a snippet, all you do is press Ctrl+Shift+P and then you type snippets, press enter, select dart, and you'll paste that entire file that I showed you in this exact location. So the first service we want to set up is our user service. So we're going to go test R tab, and we'll type user service, and that will remove the user service if it's already registered, then create a new mock version of that user service, and then register that service and return it to us. Then we'll do the same for the navigation service. And the last thing we have to do with our helper functions is to create our register service and our unregister services function. These functions will register all of the services with the locator, and the unregistered one will unregister all the services from the locator. This is made to ensure that when we write a unit test, we don't have to manually register every single service in that unit test before we know that it's working. We'll register all the services because we want to only get the services in the unit test that we'll be using in that unit test. We'll start by creating the register services function, and in this function we'll call the get and register navigation and user service. Then we'll do the same for the unregistered services, and in here we'll call locator.unregister and pass in the type that we want to unregister. Alt, Shift and down will duplicate the line that you are on, and that is all for the test helper setup. Now we can go on and start writing our unit test. We know that we're writing tests for our view model, so in the tests folder we'll create a new file under a new folder called view model tests. That file's name will be startup view model test. The extension that I'm using to do this functionality is called advanced new file, and I've mapped the new file extension to Control N. So whenever you see it pop up at the top, pressing Control N, and then I type exactly where I want the file to go, the folder, and then I type a relative path after that with the file name that will create that file for me. This way I don't have to use the mouse all the time to create the new files. Next we have to set up the startup view model test, and there's quite a little bit of boilerplate involved with setting up the unit test suite for a new file. So I created a snippet for that will also register all the services as well. To do that you can type in test mr and tab. Then we'll create the test suite for the run startup logic function. To create a test suite you type in test g, press tab, and then you type in the name of the function or property that you are testing. And now moving on to our first unit test. The first one we want to do is to check if we are getting the value has logged in user from our user service when we run our startup logic. We'll get our user service from our helper function, then we'll create our view model, and then we'll run our startup logic. Now after this is complete, we have to verify that we have checked if the user is logged in on the user service. But as you notice, the property doesn't exist on our user service yet. In TDD, this is actually also considered to be a failing test. To make this test pass, we have to first go and create that user service property. This property will return a boolean, and for the value of this property, we'll return the has user property on the Firebase authentication service. When doing unit testing, I personally like to first see my test fail, and this is because I learned unit testing when I was doing test-driven development a few years back. When you know that your test fails, you have immediate proof that the code you wrote makes the actual test pass, regardless of how trivial that piece of code might be. So if I run this code now, it will fail, and then I'll actually write the code to make that pass. To run your tests from your keyboard directly, you can press Ctrl-Shift-P and then type in .run all tests. It'll start executing, run the tests, and give you the results on the side. I would open up that list once because otherwise it'll stay closed as you run your tests. So the first thing you'll see is that it fails because of the type null. Over here, when we call verify as user, it's returning a null and not a value. So we have to stop this to return false or true. You can go to the get and register user service function, and now we'll pass in a boolean into that function. This will have the name has logged in user. We'll match it exactly with the property on the user service. Then to stub a function, we will use the when function from Mockito. Then we can give it the property or the function that we want to stub, and then we'll tell it to return the has logged in user boolean when this function is called. If you want to make running your tests a little bit faster, click on this icon to the right to configure the key binding, And I've set mine up to be Control K and Control R. That'll be for running the tests. It's just something that I became used to in Visual Studio back when I used to still use Visual Studio for C# and C++ development. Now before we run our test, we need to generate our mocks again to include the latest properties that we've added. To do that, we'll run the build runner command. If we do Control K, Control R again, we'll see that the tests actually still fail. The reason for the test failing now is actually because the code doesn't exist that needs to pass the test. So we can now go ahead and add the code required to make this test pass. If you go to the startup view model, the first thing we'll do is set up our logger for the startup view model. Then we'll get the user service from the locator, and then we can start writing the actual code. All we'll do in the startup logic for now to make the test pass is to check if we have a logged in user. Then we'll see that it now passes, so we can move on to the next set of unit tests. The next test we'll tackle is to check if we have no logged in user that we navigate to the login view. So we'll create a new single test using the test S snippet. The title of this test will be when we have no logged in user should navigate to the login view. We'll get the navigation service mock. Then we'll create our view model, and then we'll run our run startup logic function. Then we have to verify that we called the replace with function on the navigation service and that we passed in the login view route. If we run this test, it will obviously fail because this code doesn't exist. To check the reason for your failure, I still haven't found the shortcut, but you can just right click on your test and click on display test output. It'll tell us that there's no matching calls to the verification that we are doing. If you open up the run startup logic file, we'll start off by getting the navigation service from the locator, and in the else statement we'll first log out that we have no user on disk and that we're going to navigate to the login view. Then we will call our replace with function on the navigation service and pass it the login view. If you run all the tests now, it should pass and the logic should be working. This group should actually be inside of the startup view model group. If we run the tests again, everything should be working and we should have an actual suite, which is startup view model test. Inside we are testing the run startup logic function, which has 2 tests inside of it. So at this point, I usually do some unit test maintenance to ensure that down the line the unit tests don't become cumbersome to update. The first thing that we usually do in this case is to wrap the constructor into a helper function to construct and return that for us. This is because usually down the line your constructor can change parameters, and if you have tens or hundreds of unit tests on a single view model, you'll have to go and update every single unit test to take in the new parameter or to pass in an empty value where required. We'll go to the top and create a new function called getModel. This will return a newly constructed startup view model. Then we can replace all of our instances of startup view model with getModel, and that is it for now. Everything should still work the same if you run your tests. To wrap up the functionality, we can complete the last 3 parts of our business logic. We'll write a test that checks that if we have a logged in user, we call sync user account. The name of this test will be when has logged in user is true, should call sync user account on the user service. We'll start by getting the user service, and now we'll set the has logged in user value to true. Then we will get our model, and then we'll run our startup logic. Now we want to verify that we have called sync user account on the user service. When we run this test, we'll see that it obviously fails because there's no code for that test yet. To confirm the reason of failure, you can just display your test output and see that call you're expecting to be verified has never been called. Then you can go to the startup view model, and in the statement where we have a user, we will log out that we have a session on disk and that we are about to sync the user profile. And after that, we will call sync user account on the user service. If you run the test now, it should all be passing. Then we want to write a test to make sure that we get the current user from the user service when we do have a logged in user. You can duplicate the code that we just wrote. We'll update the name to when has logged in user is true, should get current user from user service. And the only thing we'll change is to check that we are getting our current user. Now this is very granular level of unit testing. I just want to show you all of the different types of unit tests that you can write to confirm that your code stays the same or that someone else doesn't break your code and your code still works as expected. We can go to the startup view model where we can get our current user. Run the test again. Ooh, both tests fail. If you look at the output, you'll see that it cannot cast null to a type of user. Whenever you have a property on a service, you need to return a value forward if it's not a nullable property. To do that, we do the same thing that we did earlier, which is stub this property to always return a value. Head over to your test helpers, go to the user service function. We'll now take in an additional property called current user. When service.currentUser is called, then return the current user, and if it's null, we'll return a newly constructed user. If you run the test again, things should be passing. One thing we'll add into our startup view model is after we get the current user, I would like to print out the information in that current user. The final piece of business logic that we need is to determine where to navigate based on if the user has a default address set. The first thing we'll have to do is go to our user model, which you can find in the application models file, and make sure that we add a new string for default address. And once we have that, we can add our property has address that checks if that model is null or not. I don't know if we need to regenerate when we add a new property, but I'm just going to regenerate the models anyway. Once we've added these properties, we can go and write the final unit tests. Copy the unit test above. Then we can write a unit test that says when current user does not have a default address, navigate to the address selection view. We'll update the unit test and we'll get the navigation service, which is what we need to verify with. Then we can remove the variable for storing the user service. And when we verify, we want to check that the navigation service got a navigate to function call passing in the address selection view. Then you can go to the startup view model. And after the logs, we will check if we have an address on the current user. In the if statement, we will navigate to the address selection view. And we'll see that it still fails. If you display the test output, you'll see that I actually made a mistake, which was an honest mistake, and it wasn't to make the unit test fail again, but I forgot to add when the user does not have the address. And this is one of the reasons that I like to have unit tests, because you can kind of forget about all the harsh and detailed checking that you're doing, and you have your test to do that for you. So it takes a little bit of cognitive load off you, which in my case has translated to being able to be productive for longer hours in a day, because I don't have to consistently go back and check my own code. So let's just run this test again. And now that it passes, I know that things are exactly as it should be. This also speeds up the development process. As you saw, I didn't run the code once, and that's because I know that the functions work as they should work. If I run this code, everything will work exactly as it should work. To test that out, I'm going to run the code for the first time. I'm just going to open up the emulator and set that up. And while that launches, we still have to call this run startup logic function in our startup view file. So open up the startup view, and we'll supply the onModelReady function and call the run startup logic function. The other thing to do is that the app currently opens up on the login view all the time. So we're going to go to the app.dart file, and we're going to change the initial property from the login view and add that onto our startup view. Then we're going to run our build function. We can check in the debugger and see which logs are printed out. That will tell us exactly what's happening in the code base. To clean up some of the logs, I gave you this tip in the previous video, but I'll tell you again. In the filter box, type in Flutter, and you will only see the logs from the build output, or after that you'll only see logs that you print out from your Flutter application. So as you see, we have a terribly long exception. This usually happens when you try to set state while Flutter is actually building. So to avoid that, we're gonna do our startup logic using the add post frame function. What we'll do is go to our scheduler binding, and on that instance, we will add a post frame callback. Then we'll move our run startup logic into that function. If we run this code again, you will see that in the startup view model, in the run startup logic, it tells us that we have no user on disk, so we can navigate to the login view. If we just log in quickly, we'll see that the login works perfectly fine. If we restart the app, we should see that we have a user session on disk. We're gonna sync that user account, go to Firestore API, we get the user has been found, return this information, user server sync account, user exists, save the current user. That's all from the sync user call in the user service. Then back in our startup logic, which we just wrote, sync user is complete, user profile is this. We know it's null and it navigated to the address selection view. That is how you speed up your development through unit testing. People always assume it slows down your development, but I didn't debug or run the code once during the actual development of this as well, even as the demonstration was going on. It speeds it up by a lot, especially when you're developing very complicated business logic that's deeper down into your application, where you won't always be able to constantly go there and test if your code is working. And with that, this is the end of this week's tutorial. Next week, we will finally start with the address selection functionality, which will have some UI involvement and set up the entire flow for a user to ensure that they have an address selected before they enter into the application. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next week in the next episode.